and kind of going to do a welcome. Oh, great. Thank you, Jason. And then we will want to kind of leave as much time as possible for the main topic that we were teeing up for this session. And wanted to welcome you all to our summer virtual brunch for the EDUCAUSE Student Success Analytics Community Group. I'm Linda Fang. I'm one of the leads for this community group, along with Mitchell Culver this year. And here, I just put up kind of like the goal of our group. So we formed this group a couple of years ago just to try to bring together practitioners and research around student success analytics. So we, I think, have formed a really great, diverse pool of interested people who are all interested in a lot of the different topics. And we have been hosting every quarter either a webinar or a virtual brunch. And the idea of our virtual brunch is really to make it more interactive. And kind of at the time when COVID hit, we were like, we just all needed a place to see and interact with real people, even if it was online. So we've kept the format going. Let me see here. So we have a pretty packed agenda for today. I'm kind of getting us through some of the welcome and announcements for the group. And then we're gonna actually spend the majority of the time talking about the Student Success Analytics Framework. We're gonna talk about how it came about, the project and the research and the group that was formed. And then we're gonna actually go through the 4 parts of the Student Success Framework. And then we actually wanna facilitate a feedback session to have you guys help us identify what areas of the framework resonate and maybe what questions are still, need to be clarified there. So that's going to be really important. So we want to leave about 15 minutes at the end after we go through the framework for that kind of feedback exercise. And then we'll go over the next steps, and then we'll be on our way. So again, just hope everyone is having a nice summer. It feels like we're finally at a point where some folks are able to travel, and I know I've seen some of you in person even just in the last month. So it's been wonderful to kind of start actually being able to plan trips. I think actually the part that I miss the most is the anticipation leading up to a trip that you might take. So for me, that's been kind of soul nourishing. Here's our group. I just wanted to introduce those. We have myself and Mitchell as the co-chairs. Marcia Ham, who's on the call, is the incoming chair for our group for starting in October. She'll be taking over as the incoming chair. Andy Miller is also here as the outgoing chair from last year. We have Kathy Pelletier, who's our EDUCAUSE liaison. And then our steering committee members. I wanted actually to take a moment to welcome 2 new steering committee members who have just come on, and I don't know if they're on yet, but Melissa Irvin from University of South Florida and Shannon Mooney, who's with Coursera, and just recently also came over from Georgetown. So we are really excited to have new folks joining the steering committee members, and stay tuned for some of the work that they're going to be contributing to for this group. And we also have a great group of existing members. So kind of to put out the plug to, if you're interested in being added as a steering committee member, reach out to myself or Mitchell or really any of us. We are looking for to replace some of the members as we have kind of like 3-year terms, and we're always interested in expanding the community in that way. And let's see what else. I think at this point, I'm going to kind of transition us to the topic at hand. And so to kind of get us started with the idea of the Student Success Analytics Framework, one of the key questions that I think would be good to kind of get us going here is just this like idea of what does student success analytics mean to you. So I'm going to put the Mentimeter link here in the chat. And I'll give you guys just a few minutes to react, and I will, hopefully you guys can see the Menti. As you guys put your answers in, we may be able to hopefully see what folks put in. Let me know if things are coming. Yes, I can see some things coming in. Yeah, I love what I'm seeing. And one of the things that I think is is important to, you know, as I reflect on this, is that while there are clusters of concepts here that we do see repeated and that many people would attribute to student success analytics, in many ways, student success analytics is going to mean something different at every institution. And so part of, I think, the impetus of, you know, what led to the idea of needing to come up with a framework was that it's important to help institutions define within for themselves what student success analytics means for them. So I do love all of the points that are coming through here through the Menti. All right, so let me kind of hand off to Marcia, and Marcia is going to take us through the background and how this group came together. Go ahead, Marcia.
Thanks. So if you follow this QR code on this particular slide, it will take you to the framework that all of the people listed on this slide contributed to. It was a mass effort, and we just really want to thank Emily Kendall for organizing all of us around this authorship. So it's important to know that the reason we decided that we needed a framework was to do exactly what Linda teed up, is that we needed a common language, a common reference point for stakeholders to work from when working towards student success analytics. Because we have differing viewpoints, we have differing definitions of what it means, how it should be used. So a framework, although it's not prescriptive, it's not to say this is how you should do things. It's kind of like provides you some guideposts, especially in the language that's being used. So this session is just to kind of look at why it's important, the different pieces of this framework, and to realize that if we didn't have a framework, there are some risks involved in doing student success analytics. So obviously the biggest one that I've alluded to is the miscommunication between departments, because we all have our different viewpoints of what it means and what needs to happen. That can translate into financial repercussions, such as, but not limited to, reinventing wheels, or, you know, duplication of efforts. That's very easy to have happen as we work in different silos. Overlooking areas of growth that are important in higher education can happen. And then just a failure to actually look at the ethical implications of what we're doing and to fulfill those responsibilities we have to our students. So as data capabilities grow, as our technologies grow and the algorithms become more and more involved, this becomes more and more important for us to have these frameworks to work from. So we developed this group, got together, we worked on it for several months. I think we started unofficially in December, and really went to town on it this spring. And so I think, I'm sorry, I meant to be showing you, oh, is she showing? Yeah, she's showing it. So
I did it.
Yeah, sorry. I'm looking at my notes and it's covering up your slides. So we came up with these 4 different points, and you can enter this framework at your institution from any of these points, which is why we have the rounded icon in the center, because it really depends on the context of the work that you guys are doing at your institutions, where you are. And I'll put a plug in for the EDUCAUSE self-assessment, institutional self-assessment for analytics. If you've not seen that, I think we had a link to it in our Connect group. Doing that and then looking at this framework can really be a nice partnership to find out where you have opportunities for improvement. And where you should be entering this framework. But so we came up with preparedness and outcomes, which Linda will be talking about here in a moment. The analysis piece, what does this data tell you? And Maureen will go over that piece, and then I'll just wrap it up and talk about the decisions piece. We're not going to go into a lot of depth because we really want to find out, after we talk about these, we want to find out from you, your thoughts, your feedback, your questions, as this is a virtual brunch. It is not about us talking at you. So I'm going to kick this over to Maureen, who's going to talk about that definition. What is or are student success analytics? So Maureen?
Thanks, Marcia. So when we got started on this process with 12 people on board, we realized really early on that we needed to define what it was that we were trying to scaffold. And with all of this is an iterative process. As Marcia shared, we are 6 months in the making here. And this is one of the big kind of reveals of this framework. And so we want feedback and to iterate on all of this work with the student success analytics and analytics community in general, specifically within the higher education or the education realm. So what we ultimately decided on, and this was a big process to come to this decision, and it required the input of people from all different kinds of institutions. And one of the people that I really admired in terms of her putting her voice out there and making sure that her voice was heard, and that of her institution and that of minority serving institutions, of which I am one. We are a Hispanic serving institution at San Diego State University. So I am not one, but I represent one. It was Isla Moore, who was on the committee. And she said, students' diverse contexts need to be taken into account here. So we need to be able to use one eye to use the academic side of the house. And then we need to be able to look at students within their student affairs context or within the student life and environment perspective. And so we came to this definition and then move forward with the constructs that follow. So we'll start with preparedness.
All right, great. Thanks, Maureen. So yeah, so with that definition and the diagram that Marcia showed us, I'm gonna, as she said, you don't have to start here at preparedness. Preparedness is a good place to start. And so wanted to kind of talk about some of the aspects that go into preparedness. So in my work, I actually spend a lot of time actually working with institutions to help them kind of do this type of thing to assess where they're at and start trying to plan for some sort of a iterative approach, thinking about, again, what might be a way forward to navigate and learn from each phase and grow the project in sort of incremental baby steps. One thing too, as we got together to think about what makes sense, is a lot of times, I mean, the first thing that is most important to do really is to build that coalition and establish that sense of who are the stakeholders for student success analytics and initiatives that may relate to or impact student success analytics. In that sense, once the groups get together, in fact, I like to tell one story about an initial meeting that we had at an institution where the folks who were sitting in the room had never actually met, and yet they were really identified as key stakeholders. And so really a lot of times just the identification of and the initial meetings that get organized around this can lead to really useful and really collaborative work, because a lot of times, people say, well, there's no group there's no one person that really you can say, oh, that's the person who's going to own all of the student success analytics initiatives. It's usually a collection of stakeholders across your institution. And the other thing too is that as soon as you get everyone in a room, immediately the question is, okay, well, where do we start? What's our North Star? How do we organize ourselves? And so one of the things that came up here was to actually think about, what might be, if your institutional mission, although, we recognize that that's a very high level goal, that could be your guiding light. If you actually try to orient around your institutional mission, that could actually start to focus down, what the set of questions are that you may want answered, what you think are the higher priority concerns that you may want to address. And that also can, you can kind of step back and say, if I'm thinking about what's the one thing that I wish my institution could do better, or that I really want to know based on analytics data that I may have at my institution that is related to student success, I could look at my institutional mission, and that may help me identify what those questions are. So that's kind of, again, where some of those questions that you also have to ask yourself at this stage is, really, organizationally and technically, is there readiness across the different key groups that would need to get involved in such a project? And at this stage, I would say there are many examples that I've seen where it turns out that the organizational readiness is perhaps more significant than technical readiness. Like I said, one school that I worked with, we went through this exercise, and in fact, they realized that they were not really ready. And so they intentionally took a step back and held off on proceeding with analytics. So they chose instead to wait for a better opportunity down the road when they could get more of their leadership buy-in to proceed. So I think having even just an exercise in place to think about where you're at, that will definitely inform how you're going to approach and what pace you're going to try to use as you move forward. So once you have brought together these stakeholders, now it's time to figure out what questions are the most important to answer. And for this, really, we think about kind of that idea of backwards design, where you start by thinking about the outcomes you want, and then you work backwards from there. And if you also think about those questions first, then you can kind of prioritize what data you're going to need to collect and also to analyze. And so again, with one of the schools that we worked with, this came into play where one of the key leaders wrote down that set of questions, and then that was really used as the blueprint for the data project that we did for them. One thing too to consider as you're thinking about formulating those outcomes and those questions is that you have to be inclusive when you're trying to factor in those diverse contexts that contribute to student success. So grades might be too narrow if you want to really look for a way to capture that holistic picture of what's going on with the student in order to best help them. And just, I'm not going to read the whole slide here, but what we've done in the framework is to break out some of the most common factors. So based on the persona, so what you can kind of look at this as a sort of starting point for a checklist of those factors that will be needed depending on what aspect or what set of questions you're going to try to hit first in your endeavor. So now I'm going to hand it back to Maureen, and we're going to keep going here with the next part of the framework.
Thank you, Linda. So the third part of our framework is analysis. And if you wouldn't mind just knocking it through, perfect, thank you. So we need to decide what kind of data to use. And having been through these other two phases, if this is where you begin, or maybe you just start off with a huge pot of raw data and it's your job to analyze it and to understand it and to be able to inform action going from it. So we're going to look at a couple of different kinds of analytics that you'll encounter on your campus. I've divided them out into institutional learning and academic analytics. And I'm very excited to see our Director of Student Success Analytics on this call. So I'm going to call out Dr. Erin Jacobs, who is just an amazing leader on our campus and an illustration of that kind of leadership, going to the source to kind of go back to the books, to the frameworks, to understand, how we might coalesce as a community around these kinds of agreed upon terms and approaches to go forward. And so our campus oftentimes looks at our analytics in terms of the system by which they come. Okay, so we've got our student information system, our course level data, which typically comes from our learning management system, and our term data, also student information system. So let's get down to the nitty gritty. This is a lot to take on. Understand that this is just an illustration of the different kinds of analytics. If you start at the top level, you've got what I just described: learning, academic, and institutional analytics. And you'll see that academic is repeated, but that's for this example in particular. Then you have 4 different types. So while you're looking within these systems or within that lens of institutional academic or learning analytics, you want to be considering the different types of analytics. So are these descriptive analytics? Are these analytics kind of telling us what happened? And these are, in my estimation, kind of simpler analytics, a little bit easier to digest. On the next box here under that academic analytics column, we have diagnostic analytics. And so that's, why did this happen? In this case, this would be academic analytics. Why did this happen? And then the inquiry example would be, how does course performance look in courses that are taken concurrently with the biology course that we're asking about in that first square? So those red squares kind of build on one another. So what percentage of students failed their first intro biology exam? How does this look with other courses? Let's widen this lens a little bit and see if we can't get some more diagnostic information from this. Then if you go to the next box, thank you, Linda, with our institutional analytics. So we're broadening the lens even further. Okay, we're getting more data in here, let's add some more data, and let's see if we can't model some of the factors that went into perhaps why or what was going on in these biology courses. But for some of us on the call, we are keenly interested in whether or not these students will persist at our institution. And so if you're able to see that students are failing intro biology, they're perhaps taking it with a bunch of other courses that don't necessarily set them up for success. Say they're taking it with an intro stats class, or maybe even some sort of a remedial math class. And that's taking a lot of their time, and students more often than not are having trouble with that. They're struggling. Are they going on academic probation? What is the probability that they will persist or leave the institution? And we would hate for all of that to lead back to they were struggling in an intro biology class, or that's where they were having a hard time balancing their time. So then you go back to the academic analytics, and we're going to look at some prescriptives here. So what should we do next? How can we nip this in the bud? How can we create an intervention that will allow these students, promote these students' success in these classes? So how can we restructure this first semester course sequence to promote that success? This takes a village. This takes a lot of different people. You've got the registrar's office involved. You've got institutional research. You've got professors. The professor is involved. You've got the department chair involved. You're starting to kind of tinker with course arrangements and course sequencing. It takes a lot of work to get there. But if you have these data to be able to make the case and show very clearly that perhaps, it's not always 100%, but perhaps there is a root cause to some of the symptoms that are presenting in perhaps student attrition or first year student struggles. And this slide deck will be available, as will be the recording. And then you can also see in the larger article that you scanned with your QR code, or that will be available, you can see each of those: descriptive, diagnostic, predictive, and prescriptive broken out in the framework.
Okay, so I'm going to take the last part about decisions. So if you were naturally going through this flow in this particular order, the decision piece obviously is after you've done the analysis. Now, how are you going to use it toward the greater good at your institution according to your institutional goals? So you can go ahead and flip. Yeah, there we go. So one thing to consider is that a lot of times we hear data-driven decision-making, and we are trying to move towards this idea of data-informed decision-making, because you can't pull the human element out of it, nor should you. We're not looking to be owned by machines and owned by algorithms. We actually want to just use this information, and then we make the decisions based on what is best at our institution. So, and there are some ethical considerations that you want to include in here. Basically, these ethical considerations related to your goals in student success analytics go to these different principles that we lay out in the framework. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. So, there they are. Okay, so these ethical principles, first of all, it's kind of like the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm. That's our goal, is to actually lift up our students without biasing one group over another. Everybody, lift all the students up so everybody can feel success and experience success. Respect for our students as human beings, as autonomous individuals who we are trying to build up in their ability to make decisions and have control over their destinies. Accountability for our efforts, which means we come back, we try something, we assess how well did it work, is it working, do we need to make some changes along the way, and that accountability factor should be built into your structure of how you're doing student success analytics. It should just be something, it's not a one-time thing. It's built into in a regular flow, in a regular work pattern. And then autonomy, privacy, equity. We should be striving for these three entities in the work that we're doing. And you know, we want to make sure that we are not inadvertently biasing one group over another in our solutions when we get to that prescriptive piece, or earlier, because as we know, the bias can result in unintended consequences, and the bias can creep in. I call it bias creep. It can creep in anywhere if we're not consciously aware and analyzing these as we go through our work here. So we want to start with the data sets, the data that we're pulling, the algorithms that we're using, the programs that we're using and building, the analysis of the data. You know, the bias can creep in there, the interpretation of the data, and then obviously the use of that data. So you can see where it can be anywhere in there. And we're not perfect. We are humans because we are using the data to inform our decisions. This also has to be a part of that accountability factor as we go through and analyze what we're doing and see where we can make improvements along the way. So I think we are good to move on, Linda. Yeah, I'm going to kick this over to you. We are going to start doing stuff with this.
Yeah. So now that we've kind of given you the overview of the 4 parts of the framework, we would like to hear from you. So I'm going to put the link to the Jamboard, and I'll just come over here. So we've got a Jamboard, and hopefully it is open for everyone. If you haven't used this, and let me see if I can just make this bigger on the screen. So what you can do is you could either create a new sticky and make it whatever color you want, and then put that in and then move it around, or you could just take one of these and duplicate it, move it to wherever you want it to go. So what we'd like to do is just kind of collect any comments you have, and maybe like as you're putting the background of this, you know, just feel free to paper over what's here. And generally speaking, if you know your comment has to do with one of these sections, try to move it towards that section. And we could, I'll give you guys a couple minutes to collect your thoughts. And feel free to actually make copies of that, and then you can make copies of the plus sign or even the question mark and put those wherever they need to be.
And Linda, if people aren't feeling super jammy this morning, can we take a few questions?
Yeah,
Well,
absolutely.
I actually had a question before we do that. Hi, everybody. George
Hey,
Weary
George.
from Indiana University,
George.
Bloomington. Nice to see some of you folks again. In doing this, are you planning on going through different sections?
Yeah, what I thought I
Because I
would
have a
do is,
comment about something else that's not in this slide, so I wanted to hold off. If it's for, are we going to go through the different sections and have comments that way?
yeah, I was thinking we would go through like maybe the
Okay.
different by section, if that's what you mean,
Okay.
like the 4 different sections. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you.
Mhm. Give us just like 1 or 2 more minutes. So yeah, so as I look at this, first is I think I'm noticing that people like the swirly spiral icon. So I think that's what these plus signs mean. Hopefully that's correct, but let me know if I got that wrong. And I like, so some of the questions that are coming out on the preparation, so data governance. So yeah, and data governance is something that is covered as part of the institutional self-assessment tool. And I meant to mention that Marcia and Maureen and I actually facilitated a workshop at ELI last month, and walked a number of schools through the process of going through the self-assessment tool. What we're finding is that, yeah, again, the self-assessment tool is just that. It's meant for you to take a look through a variety of different sections to assess where you think you might be, and then solicit some of your peers or other key stakeholders at your institution to try to come up with more or less a number of different viewpoints, to then really start that conversation on your campus about how folks feel they are or aren't at different levels, and data governance is one of those sections. So it is very much most of the self-assessment tool, and the idea of assessing is really not to say that there is necessarily like you're not being graded on this. It's really just trying to take a snapshot of where you're at with as much of a realistic picture of where you're at, just so that you can determine what steps you would best be suited for you to take as you're getting started on the journey.
Linda, can I add to that, if you don't mind?
Yeah, of course.
Just looking at one of the other Post-it notes, the one over on the orange one next to outcomes, or at the bottom of outcomes, it says, "I'm trying to create a simple story of the data. What has worked for multiple versions of the truth?" What I guess I wanted to highlight here, this really does tie back to that data governance. I mean, the question of what is a student? I mean, if people show up to the same meeting with different definitions of a student, you're going to have to inevitably reconcile those numbers. And why I'm bringing that up is part of what I think Linda mentioned before, that this is not a linear process. It could be this outcomes conversation drives a data governance structure, saying, we need to actually codify these student definitions. Well, that's data governance. And maybe you're not, as an institution, prepared for that yet, but now you know something that needs to go into that preparedness conversation. So
yeah,
just
great point, Andy. And yeah, sort of also related to this, I think we had several conversations where we were like, it's not like you do preparedness and then you're done, right? The whole idea here is that you're going to be kind of like at your first go around, and then you may like come up with some steps you want to take, but then at some point down the road, you're going to want to reassess and then plan from there to try to understand, what's the next best plan based on where you have arrived, not necessarily where you may have started from when you first did this. This is also interesting. And again, feel free to jump in at this point. We would love to just hear, you can come off mute and turn your video on if you're comfortable with that. Just to, make this more of a dialogue. For the section, whether or not there's a go, not recommended to go checklist. I think that one is, because it's going to be different for every institution, I think that would be kind of like considered maybe one of the goals of coming out of that preparedness and that assessment would be to think about what would you consider to be your kind of go, not recommended to go type of milestone. I don't know, others may want to weigh in.
Linda, I just want to kind of weigh in on this. I am heading up a group that's kind of iterating finally to get the infrastructure put into place to do learning analytics. So part of that was, what are the key questions that we want to know right now? What are the low-hanging fruits that we think we can noodle on right now? So we have a team. And one of the things that came out of that was, what do we mean by student success? What do we mean by an online student? Who is, this person? What is this? And so we have a team that's working on the data governance because we identified that from our outcomes. We went back to preparedness. We need to come up with a domain structure and the definitions for those things. And then we have another team that's actually going to be working on taking a few of those questions and creating the infrastructure needed to pull data out of our learning systems into a big data lake, if you will. We call it the Ray. And we're going to just pilot some of those smaller, easier questions to see how this works. And I think that might be one way of, do we go, not go? Well, if you start small, it's easier to go. And so then you can grow it, you can iterate, and I think that might help build momentum instead of this, are we ready to jump in to the deep end? Well, you don't necessarily have to get into a pool at the deep end.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's a key common theme that I've also seen is that schools have found that they can identify that piece that there's motivation, perhaps in one division, one unit at the institution that can help drive, and then that they can then use that as the kind of early success that can serve as an inspiration to further work. Great. I'm going to also just kind of move over here to this sort of this right side. So we have outcomes. I really like this question here about conflicting outcomes. So if you're saying like, I want to do one thing, but it's actually going to diminish another. Does whoever put that in, do you want to maybe elaborate on that question or comment?
Yeah, hi, this is Rob Rollison from RIT. Yeah, it was basically, you got it. This is everything. So, I mean, if you try to drive something in one direction, that's good. But I mean, I keep going back to things like, if the board of trustees are really after upping your US News and World Report rating, is that against trying to help these underprivileged students that have been traditionally marginalized? Those two things are almost in conflict. So which one of those you do? So I think you often find yourself with outcomes. It's good to think about what it is you're really trying to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Does that resonate with others here on the call? I feel like that is part of what tends to happen when you have those groups that get together. And so it is very important to kind of make sure that there is a safe space for folks to come together in those initial early stages so that they can kind of feel kind of vulnerable with each other and really be open and honest about coming to terms with some of those conflicting decisions.
And that was one of the, I think, key call outs in this outcome section is having that awareness of the decisions are making and the intent to impact a particular outcome. Rob, just like you shared, I mean, I think that was one of the ones we talked about was that juxtaposition between access and opportunity and student performance, and not that the two are mutually exclusive, but sometimes, you know, an increase in one can decrease in another. And so, yeah, as Linda said, to have those conversations and make those decisions, recognizing the impact it'll have was really, I think, one of the key components of that conversation.
Yeah. I'm going to move now to the analysis section. It looks like there was a question mark and some questions here about what office in our institution might we try to engage to help with analysis. I'm wondering if folks have thoughts on that. Anyone want to share? I guess I'll just say, you know, from a like I said, once in my experience, you know, it has been valuable to think about phasing in the same way that Maureen's diagram showed, where in general, those kind of more descriptive types of information are like easier, they're the low-hanging fruit. So usually that's kind of where everyone starts, and you're more likely to succeed with those kinds of inquiries, and then kind of moving from there requires, you know, more analysis to understand what the correlations are, you know, what additional kind of broadening that lens and what additional data points you may need to start to fill in. But yeah, I mean, I have seen that there are different groups. I think typically IT ends up being in a supporting role for either institutional research or business intelligence at the institution to try to who kind of comes up with essentially the question that needs to be answered, or how to fulfill that answer. And there are, again, the key stakeholders tend to be depending on the question, but in some cases it might be instructional design and curriculum. It may be you know, other parts around advising that, you know, so really just depends on who's driving the conversation for that question that needs to be answered.
Augie Frieda, he's at Notre Dame. He was like, when he talked about this, he kind of showed me that the analysis isn't strictly statistical either. I mean, I think that was part of my misconception, is that analysis had to be done by IR or a statistician, but he really encouraged us to consider including subject matter experts, as Linda said, the people who understand the data very intimately, because it's through those different lenses that really helps you answer the questions that you're asking, and providing that analysis in the appropriate context for the bigger picture. So
yeah, and one thing that I have seen work really well is almost like workshopping maybe an initial visual. So people react more when there's something to look at, and then they can see, you know, and then they start to ask questions. Oh, you know, what does this really mean? You know, how many of these students are we counting? And so then that leads to the deeper discussion about, you know, do we have the same definition around, you know, what it means to be a first-year student in that capacity.
And I just wanted to add to it, at Berkeley, I think we've had some success with building partnerships by helping groups in the advising domain primarily solve data problems that are challenging to them, but aren't necessarily getting us into the analytics realm. Things like federally funded programs that have really complex reporting requirements, complex in the sense that every student participating in the program needs about 30 to 35 data points captured and reported onto the federal government annually. And so by using our kind of data lake and analytics infrastructure, we've been able to begin building processes to really automate kind of the generation of those reports, so that these folks who are really focused on advising and student success in their day-to-day work can maybe unburden themselves of the dozens, if not hundreds of hours of labor required in building those reports manually, and doing work that, you know, from a systems perspective is quite easy to pull fields from the data lake, populate them into a CSV in a particular format, and make that available on demand. And so while that work in and of itself is maybe not quite analytics, maybe treading the edges of descriptive analytics, we're certainly sort of demonstrating the value of data nonetheless, I think, to create that buy-in and understanding of the power of data, and say, we can solve the problems you have and you know about, and what else would you like to know and do with this
Yes.
data?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great example, Stephen, of kind of that early stage kind of trust building, and being able to say, hey, you know, even if this is still providing valuable service, it may not be kind of like answering perhaps some of those higher order questions, but at the same time, I think you establish that trust with the different key stakeholders, and then that can lead to more acceptable ways to kind of move up in that chain. I also liked Maria's comment about the book, You Are a Data Person, and yeah, that everyone kind of has that data identity regardless of where they are in the org chart. So thank you for that comment, Maria.
Yeah, thanks, Maria.
I know we have go ahead, Maureen.
Well, and I just, you know, the question about predictive analytics and personalized learning is here, and I don't want to really parking lot that, you know, that question. It's a really, really good question. And there are a couple of points in the article, in the framework article, that discuss bias that exist within the data. And this idea of data literacy and data fluency, as we're starting to adopt that terminology at our institution, just because somebody doesn't fully understand what happens within an algorithm, whether you're running random forest or a logistic regression, even if you have a good sense of the statistics, to not necessarily know which data are missing or not represented, to not have that fluency to fully look at the picture, at the data set, is problematic. And that would be an unintended ethical consequence. So this is a really, really good question, and perhaps something even for a longer discussion, for another brunch, for perhaps a subset of this population who would be interested in digging a little bit deeper into what are going on, and what's the cost and the benefit, or the risk and the opportunity of employing predictive personalized learning analytics within the classroom. Does that mean within res ed? Does that mean you're doing it within, you know, advising? What domain would that be in? So I truly appreciate that big question there. I didn't want to
that is
over
definitely
the sticky post-it there.
Yeah, I like that question too. And I just, one thing I want to point out here is that it should always concern us. Like, we're never going to use analytics. We're never going to get to that point, hopefully, where we're not concerned about it. So that might be just wordsmithing into that question, but this is part of what I had mentioned with the decisions, is that it needs to be coming back, that accountability piece. You're always going back to take a look at what you're using and how you're doing it. So
yeah, absolutely. And kind of also back to the, like, as you're looking at this, it may be that you identify there are key responsibilities or roles that may need to be carved out, or maybe inserted into your process. And so that kind of also gets back to, that reassessment phase. So the preparedness includes the idea of reassessing your existing roles and responsibilities, and making sure that there are appropriate places where people can take ownership.
There's also a question here about the sources for the 4 different sections that we came up with. All of those resources, the references we used are at the bottom of the framework. But it was our group having conversations based on, you know, our readings and our collective knowledge that came up with, hey, you know what, it seems like we've got these 4 different themes that
Right.
present themselves. So that's how they came to fruition. But you can see all those resources that we used at the bottom of the framework document.
Right. And so the goal here, I think, with this framework was just to try to put these things into buckets to make it easy for people to grapple with each of the key considerations as you go through this process. So yeah, the 4 buckets were, you know, something that the group collectively ended up identifying. Thanks. George, I know you had said that you had something you wanted to bring up. Did you, we have a few minutes here.
Yeah,
Was there something specific?
Linda, I was just typing in the chat. I have actually to go. I got to run a meeting for my Learning Analytics Fellows starting in 4 minutes. So I got to run. I'll send something to you guys in a message. I don't want to start a conversation I can't be in. Thanks.
Okay, thanks,
Sorry,
George.
I gotta go.
Yeah, and so we'll just kind of close out. I hope that this has been useful. We really appreciate all of the great dialogue and the questions and comments that came through here. If you do have more discussion and thoughts, we do invite you to join our conversation. So we have links here for our Slack channel and the community group. So I will put those into the chat. And thank you guys for attending. And I will just, can't type in, hopefully this one. And then also we have our discussion forum in EDUCAUSE's Connect site. So we hope to continue the conversation there. We will have our next webinar for the fall will be coming up probably September, October timeframe. If you have ideas for speakers, please send them to Jason. And thank you again, Jason, for organizing our Zoom session. And we thank you all and hope that you have a great rest of your day and rest of the week.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks again.